start with the part number 2 for class 12, that is the sexual reproduction in flowering plant, and this is chapter number 2. And in part number 1 we are already discussed up to pollen grains, how the pollen grains takes place in the flowering plants. So pollen grains generally vary in shapes and sizes. They are generally rounded and their size vary from 25 to 30 micrometer. Pollen grains are generally haploid, unicellular body with a single nucleus, and pollen grains have generally two-layered wall. Sporoderm consists of two layers. That is, the outer layer is the exine, that is thick layer, and the inner layer is the intine, that is thin layer. So this is all about the pollen grains, and this is the diagrammatically representation regarding the pollen grains. These are the vacuoles, and inside the vacuoles there is a nucleus, and the shape is the asymmetric spindle, and two types of the cells that occur, that is the vegetative cell and the generative cell. So these are two types of the cells, vegetative cell and the generative cell. Now today we will start with the development of the male gametophyte. How the development of the male gametophyte takes place in the pollen grains. The nucleus increases in size inside the pollen grains. जो nucleus का size है, that will be increased inside the pollen grains. It divides mitotically. अब जो pollen grains है, that is nucleus जो है वो क्या कर रहा है, इंक्रीज कर रहा है साइज में इनसाइड द pollen grains. अब वो माइटोटिकली डिवाइड करेंगे और प्रोड्यूस करेंगे टू अनइक्वल डॉटर सेल्स को. जैसे ही वो माइटोटिकली डिवाइड करेंगे, माइटोटिकली डिवाइड करने के बाद दे प्रोड्यूस टू अनइक्वल डॉटर सेल्स. बिगर इज द वेजिटेटिव सेल और ट्यूब सेल. द अदर नेम ऑफ द वेजिटेटिव सेल इज द ट्यूब सेल. तो जब वो टू अनइक्वल डॉटर सेल्स में डिवाइड करेगा, तो टू अनइक्वल डॉटर सेल्स में डिवाइड करने के बाद वन इज द वेजिटेटिव सेल और द ट्यूब सेल, and the smaller is the generative cell. That means there are two types of the daughter cells that divides mitotically. Pollination can occur when the pollen grain is two cell. अब pollination जो होगी वो कब occur करेगी, जब pollen grains होंगे that are two cell. That means pollen grains are two cell, tube plus generative, और three cell tube plus two male gametes. मतलब ये हो गया कि जब pollination अकर करेगी pollen grains के अंदर, that means when they are two cell that is tube plus generative, and when they are three cell that is tube plus two male gametes. However, in plants such as cereals, अगर हम कुछ plants की बात करते हैं such as cereals, the male gametes form while the pollen, वो क्या बनाएंगे, pollen बनाएंगे, that is still within the anther, and that pollen is still within the anther. Next, in those cases, अगर हम इन cases में देखें where pollen is shed at two celled stage, जहां पर pollen जो होता है वो shed करता है two celled stage में, then the generative cell divides after pollen has landed on stigma. उस टाइम जो generative cell होगा वो divide करेगा, और divide करने के बाद जो pollen होगा that is landed on stigma. वो किसके ऊपर land कर जाएगा, stigma के ऊपर land कर जाएगा. The cytoplasm of the generative cell does not contain, जो आपका cytoplasm का generative cell होगा that does not contain much of the stored food material. That means that cytoplasm where the generative cell occur, that means at that time it does not contains much for stored food material. Fat, starch and proteins, that are fat, starch and protein granules are present in the vegetative cell. Stored food material that is present in the generative cell, and the fat, starch and the protein granules, all these are present in the vegetative cell. So this is the male gametophyte, that is the development of the male gametophyte. Our next important topic is the pollen products. What do you mean by the pollen products? Pollen food supplements. First is the pollen food supplements. Pollen grains contains abundant carbohydrates. जो pollen grains हैं, that means at that time they contains much more abundant carbohydrates and unsaturated fats. That means abundant carbohydrates and unsaturated fats that they are present in the pollen grains. They are used in the form of, वो किस फॉर्म में यूज होंगे, टैबलेट्स एंड सिरप्स की फॉर्म में. That means that carbohydrates and unsaturated fats, they are used in the form of tablets and syrups for enhancing vital body function. बॉडी फंक्शंस को मेंटेन करने के लिए, वाइटल बॉडी फंक्शंस को मेंटेन करने के लिए, दैट मीन्स दैट कार्बोहाइड्रेट्स एंड food material of saturated fats, they are used in the form of syrups and the tablets. Pollen consumption, जो pollen की consumption होगी, that increases performance. अब जो जितनी pollen की consumption होगी, that means that increases the, किस चीज को increase करेंगे वो, performance and used by the athletes. That performance is used by the athletes and given to race horses. That means that syrups and tablets, they are given to the athletes as well as the race horses. Next is the pollen grains. Pollen grain protects themselves. अब pollen grains जो हैं वो अपने आप को बचाते हैं किस चीज से? UV rays, that is the ultraviolet rays. Thus they are used in creams. इस वजह से जो ये pollen products है किस चीज में यूज होते हैं? Pollen grains जो होते हैं, they are used in the creams, emulsions and for providing smoothness and protection to skin. अब जो स्मूथनेस है बॉडी की या प्रोटेक्शन जो है स्किन की, वो किस वजह से होती है? दैट दे आर यूज्ड, दैट इज द pollen creams. That means they are protect us themselves from the UV rays, and that creams are used in the creams as well as emulsions for providing the smoothness and protecting the skin from other harmful ultraviolet rays. Next is the pollen viability. What do you mean by pollen viability? The period for which pollen grains remains viable. ऐसा period जहां पर pollen grains जो होंगे they remain viable और functional. जहां पर जो pollen grains होंगे वो viable रहेंगे और functional रहेंगे is called as the pollen viability. उसको हम क्या कहेंगे? Pollen viability. In other words, we can say that the period for which the pollen grains remains viable and functional, that is called as the pollen viability. It depends upon the temperature and humidity. Pollen viability depends upon that means the conditions that are favorable for the pollen viability, that is the temperature and humidity. These are the two major factors on which we can say that the pollen viability depends. Next, pollen grains remain viable for 30 minutes. The main duration for the pollen viability, that is for only 30 minutes. That means pollen viability that can be stand only up to 30 minutes. Pollen grains can be cryopreserved in liquid nitrogen. हम pollen grains को cryopreserved कर सकते हैं किसमें? That is in the liquid nitrogen. Temperature is near about 196 degrees Celsius and that are used as a pollen banks. और उस चीज को हम किस तौर पर यूज करते हैं? That are used in the form of the pollen banks. Next is the pollen allergy, the important topic of this chapter, that is the pollen allergy. What do you mean by pollen allergy? Pollen grain produce severe allergy. जो pollen grains होते हैं, that means they produce the severe allergy. It causes have fever. क्या cause करते हैं वो? Fever, common respiratory disorders, and such as these common respiratory disorders such as asthma and bronchitis. These are the common respiratory disorders that are related with the pollen allergy. Carrot grass, and the common name of the carrot grass, that is the Paytm hystertropus, is major source of the pollen allergy. This carrot grass, that is the major source of the pollen allergy. That means the pollen allergy is caused by the major factor, that is the carrot grass. It also causes harm to internal body organs. अब ये जो carrot grass है, it also causes damage to our internal delicate body parts. It was introduced in India. ये introduced कब हुआ था इंडिया में? Along with the imported wheat. That means it is introduced in India with the imported wheat. So this is all about the pollen allergy, and next the important topic of this chapter after the development of the male gametophyte, that is the female reproductive unit, and the important female reproductive unit in case of the flowering plant, that is the pistil. So let us know about this female reproductive unit. The pistil or the gynoecium, pistil is also known as gynoecium. The pistil or the gynoecium of a flower is the female reproductive unit. That means pistil or gynoecium, it is known as the female reproductive unit of the flower. A carpel or pistil has three parts. After that, carpel as well as pistil, it is divided into three major parts, and these three major parts are style, stigma and ovary. The three major parts of the carpel or the pistil are style, stigma and ovary. Stigma, what do you mean by stigma? The part that receives pollen grains. ऐसा part जो किस चीज को receive करता है? Pollen grains को receive करता है. That part is known as the stigma. Next, style, the stalk that connects the stigma to the ovary. ऐसा part जो स्टिग्मा को किस चीज से कनेक्ट करता है? ओवरी से कनेक्ट करता है. दैट इज द इंटरमीडिएट कनेक्शन बिटवीन द स्टिग्मा एंड द ओवरी, दैट इज नोन एज द स्टॉक. नेक्स्ट इज द ओवरी. स्वॉलन रीजन प्रेजेंट एट द बेस. फूला हुआ हिस्सा जो होता है वो कहां पर प्रेजेंट होता है? फ्लावर के बेस पर प्रेजेंट होता है, फ्लावर के नीचे प्रेजेंट होता है. And that is ovary contains 1 to several ovules. और उस ovary के अंदर जो होते हैं, that means at that time ovary contains number of ovules that are present in the ovary. Ovule is a megasporangium. Ovule जो है, that is the megasporangium that is surrounded by the integuments. अब ovule जो है, they are the megasporangium, and these megasporangium they are surrounded by the integuments, and on the process of fertilization the ovules ripens. जैसे ही fertilization का process होगा, at that time the ovules ripens into a seed. और उस टाइम fertilization के दौरान जो ovules होंगे वो ripens हो जाएंगे, और ripens होने के दौरान वो किस में convert हो जाएंगे? They convert into a seed. It is oval and whitish. The shape of the ovules are, they are generally oval, and the color of the ovules are whitish. That means they are whitish in color. Next is the funicle or funiculus. Stalk that connects the ovule to the placenta. ऐसा stage, ऐसा stalk जो किस चीज को connect करता है? Connect the ovule. Ovule को किस चीज के साथ connect करेगा? They connect the ovule to the placenta. That is known as the funicle or funiculus. Hilum, the point of attachment of funicle. ऐसा point जहां पर किस चीज की attachment होती है? Funicle की attachment होती है किसके साथ? Ovule के साथ. Next is the arraf ridge that is formed by the fusion of funiculus. जो ridge है और the arraf that is formed by the fusion of funiculus that is present within the body of the ovule. Next is the actual part equivalent to the megasporangium. The actual part जो है that is equivalent to the megasporangium is parenchymatous tissue, and that parenchymatous tissue is known as the nucleus. The nucleus could be thin or massive. जो nucleus है that could be thin or massive. When the nucleus is thin, it is called a tenuinucleate. उसको हम उस टाइम क्या कहेंगे? tenuinucleate. Example, composite family. That means it belongs to the composite family. When the nucleus is massive, जब हमारा nucleus होगा that is massive, it is called as the crassinucleate. उस टाइम उसको हम क्या कहेंगे? crassinucleate. And example is the Cassiduraceae family. That means it belongs to the Cassiduraceae family. On the basis of number of integuments, अगर हम इंटेग्यूमेंट्स के बिहार पर देखें या ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ द नंबर ऑफ इंटेग्यूमेंट्स, ओव्यूल्स आर ऑफ द फॉलोइंग टाइप्स. अगर हम इंटेग्यूमेंट्स के बिहार पर देखते हैं, एट दैट टाइम वी कैन डिवाइड द ओव्यूल्स इनटू द डिफरेंट मेजर कैटेगरीज. First is the unitegmic. The first type of the ovule is the unitegmic. Within one integument, unitegmic, name understood करवा रहा है. Uni means single. That means at that time one integument is present. It is seen in higher dicots. Unitagment जो है वो कहां पर सीन होता है? That is seen in the higher dicots like composite and gymnosperms. और higher family या higher dicots कौन से होंगे? Like the composite and the gymnosperms. That is the unitagment. Second type of the ovules are the bitegment. Bi means two. That is ovules within the two integuments. ऐसे ovules जिसमें कितने integuments होंगे? They are present two integuments in the bitegment. It is seen in monocots. किसमें seen होते हैं ये bitegment? They are seen in the monocots as well as the primitive dicots, and the primitive dicots like the crucifery and the Malvaceae. These are the two types of the families that are present in the bitegment. Next is the tritegment with three integuments. Tri means three. The name understood करवा रहा है. That means at that time इस ओव्यूल में जो होंगे वो थ्री इंटेगुमेंट्स प्रेजेंट होंगे. दैट इज लाइक इन एस्फोडेल्स. नेक्स्ट इज द एटेगमिक विदाउट इंटेगुमेंट्स. देयर आर no number of integuments are present in the ovules. That means at that time they are without integuments, and this is seen in the centellum, loranthus, gersonoma and aulex. So these are the various types of the ovules that are present in the ovary. Next is the place of origin of integuments is called chalaza. जहां पर इंटेगुमेंट्स की प्लेस है, जहां पर उनको ओरिजिन किया जाता है इंटेगुमेंट्स का, दैट इज नोन एज द chalaza. A pore is present in the integuments. ऐसा पोर जो किसमें प्रेजेंट होगा? इंटेगुमेंट में प्रेजेंट होगा एट द एंड ऑपोजिट टू द chalaza end. कहां पर प्रेजेंट होगा? एट द एंड. दैट एंड इज ऑपोजिट टू द chalaza end. इट इज नोन एज माइक्रोपाइल. उसको हम क्या कहेंगे? माइक्रोपाइल. नेक्स्ट इज द इनर रीजन ऑफ द इंटेगुमेंट. जो इनर हिस्सा है इंटेगुमेंट का, सबसे इनर मोस्ट रीजन जो होगा इंटेगुमेंट का, एंड द इनर रीजन ऑफ द इंटेगुमेंट्स में नरिश, वो नरिश करेंगे किस चीज को? द डेवलपिंग एम्ब्रॉय सैक. जो भी डेवलपिंग एम्ब्रॉय सैक्स होंगे उसमें जो इनर रीजन है इंटेगुमेंट का, वो क्या करेगा? उस डेवलपिंग एम्ब्रॉय सैक को क्या करेगा? नरिश करेगा. इट इज कॉल्ड एज द एंडोथीलियम. उसको हम क्या कहेंगे? एंडोथीलियम. दैट इज नोन एज द एंडोथीलियम. आउटर रीजन ऑफ ईच इंटेगुमेंट, बाहर वाला हिस्सा जो है हर एक इंटेगुमेंट का, वो क्या कहलाएगा? एंड द न्यूक्लियस पोजेसेस क्यूटिकल. वो क्या पोजेस करेगा? क्यूटिकल को. In castor bean, that is the ricinus, the integumentary cells proliferate at the micropylar region. उसमें वो कहां पर proliferate करेंगे? Micropylar region को. This forms the structure that is called as the caruncle, and that structure is known as caruncle. It performs two functions. ये जो है chalaza form जो है, chalaza जो है, that means it forms the two major important functions. It absorbs water को absorb करेगा and helps in the seed germination. It is made up of sugary substance. किस चीज से मिलकर बना हुआ है? That is made up of the sugary substance, and thus seed dispersal occurs. और उसके बाद जो होता है, जब वो sugary material को या sugary substance को मिलकर बना हुआ है, that means at thus seed dispersal occurs by ants. और उस टाइम जो होगा वो seed dispersal जो होगा, that is occur by the plants. So these are the two major important functions that is regarding the ovules. Next is the diagrammatically representation of the ovule. This is the chalazal pole, and inner side there is the embryo sac. This is the embryo sac, and after the embryo sac this is the nucleus, and after nucleus there is inner integument, and after that there is the outer integument. That means it is divided into two layers, inner integument and the outer integument. After that there is the micropylar pole. उसके बाद वहां पर क्या है? Micropylar pole है. After that there is the funicle, and last one is the hilum. So this is the diagrammatically representation of the ovule. Next is the forms of ovule. How many types of ovules are present in the ovule? That means there are various types of ovules that are present in the ovary. So let us start with the forms of the ovule and discuss one by one. First form of the ovule is the orthotropous, that is erect. द बॉडी ऑफ द ओव्यूल लाइज स्ट्रेट, इसमें जो बॉडी है ओव्यूल की वो कैसे लाई करती है, स्ट्रेट लाई करती है एंड डायरेक्टली ओवर द फ्यूनिकल, और डायरेक्टली किसके ऊपर होती है, वो फ्यूनिकल के ऊपर होती है। हाइलम, चलेजा एंड माइक्रोपाइल लाइज ऑन द सेम लाइन। Hilum as well as Chaleza and Micropyle, all of them they lie on the same line. Example, polygonal. The common example of the orthotropous ovule, that is the polygonal. This is the orthotropous ovule. This is a diagrammatically representation of the orthotropous ovule. At the base there is the funicle, and after the funicle this is the Chaleza, and after the Chaleza this is the nucleus part, and in the nucleus there is innermost, that is the embryonic sac, and outer side the embryonic sac there are integuments that are present outside the embryonic sac, and on the upper side this is the micropyle. So this is the diagrammatically representation of the orthotropous ovule. And the second type of the ovule is the anatropous, that is inverted. The body of the ovule is inverted. इसमें जो body होगी ovule की वो कैसे होगी, inverted होगी. The ovule is fused with the funicle. इसमें ovule जो होगा वो किसके साथ fused करेगा, that is fused with the funicle. The fusion, अब क्या होगा, fusion होगा किसके साथ, of the ovule within the funicle forms. अब fusion of the ovule that is within the funicle forms a ridge. अब जब फ्यूजन होगा किसी चीज का ओव्यूल का फ्यूनिकल के साथ, एट दैट टाइम दे फॉर्म्स द रिज, एंड दैट रिज इज नोन एज द रफे, एंड उस रिज को हम क्या नाम देंगे, रफे का। हाइलम एंड माइक्रोपाइल, बोथ हाइलम एंड माइक्रोपाइल आर क्लोज टू द फ्यूनिकल. माइक्रोपाइल एज वेल एज हाइलम, दे बोथ ऑफ देम दे क्लोज टू द फ्यूनिकल. वो किसके साथ क्लोज कर जाएंगे, फ्यूनिकल के साथ क्लोज कर जाएंगे. The Chaleza is on the end. Chaleza जो होगा वो एक एंड पर है and opposite to the micropyle. Chaleza that is at one end and it opposite to the micropyle, and it is the most common type of the ovule. That means anatropous. It is the most common type of the ovule, and the common example of the anatropous ovule is the ranunculus. So this is the second type of the ovule, that is the anatropous ovule, and it is erected. Next is the various types of the functions that related to the ovules. First is the funicle. The ovule is attached to the placenta. इसमें जो ovule होगा वो कहाँ पर attached होगा, placenta के साथ attached होगा. अब प्लेसेंटा के साथ वो कैसे अटैच होगा, बाय मीन्स ऑफ स्टॉक. स्टॉक की हेल्प से जो ओव्यूल होगा वो प्लेसेंटा के साथ अटैच होगा, एंड दैट इज नोन एज फ्यूनिकल. दैट मीन्स द ओव्यूल इज अटैच्ड टू द प्लेसेंटा. अब ओव्यूल प्लेसेंटा के साथ अटैच कर रहा है, दैट इज विद द हेल्प ऑफ ए स्टॉक, एंड दैट स्टॉक इज नोन एज द फ्यूनिकल. नेक्स्ट इज द हाइलम. The body of the ovule fuses with funicle. इसमें जो body है ovule की वो fuse करेगी किसके साथ, funicle के साथ, in the region, and that region is known as the hilum. Hilum, in other words, we can say the meaning of the hilum is the junction between the ovule and the funicle. Hilum is that place where is the junction between the ovule and the funicle. Next is the integuments. Each ovule has one or two protective envelopes. हर एक ovule के पास एक या एक से अधिक जो है वो क्या होंगे, envelopes होंगे, and that envelopes are called as the integuments. That means there are two types of the integuments, inner integument and the outer integument. Outer integument, outer layer is thick and the inner layer is thin. That is known as the integument. Next is the Chaleza, opposite the micropylar end. ये कहां पर होगा, दैट इज टोटली अपोजिट टू द माइक्रोपाइलर, एंड दैट इज Chaleza, रिप्रेजेंटिंग द बेसल पार्ट्स ऑफ द ओव्यूल. जो किसको रिप्रेजेंट करेगा, जो बेस पर जो ओव्यूल हैं उनको ये रिप्रेजेंट करेगा. नेक्स्ट है न्यूक्लियस, टिश्यू एनक्लोजेस एम्ब्रॉयड सेल. जो टिश्यू किस चीज को एनक्लोज करेगा, एम्ब्रॉयड सेल को एनक्लोज करेगा, उसको हम क्या कहेंगे, न्यूक्लियस. एम्ब्रॉयड सेल्स, दैट इज द फीमेल गैमेटोफाइट. An ovule generally has a single embryo sac. हर एक ovule के पास जो होगा वो generally single embryo sac होगा, formed from a megaspore. जो कहां से बनेगा? मेगास्पोर से बनेगा through the reduction division. मेगास्पोर के थ्रू तो बन रहा है, but that is formed with the help of the reduction division. Next, nucleate and seven cell. It is nucleate and the types of the cells that are present in them are seven celled. Egg apparatus है, at micropylar end it has two synergids and then egg. दो synergids होंगे इसमें and one is the egg. Filiform apparatus, that are synergids. Special thickening at the micropylar end. It guides the pollen tubes. Next is the antipodals, and what are antipodals? 3 number. The number of the antipodals that are 3 and towards the chalazer end. अब ये जो antipodal cells होंगे, their number is 3 and their end is towards the chalazer end. 2 haploid nuclei इसमें, that is at the polar end below the egg apparatus. So these are the functions regarding with the ovules. Next is the structure of the typical antipodal ovule. ये जो है, that is the structure of the typical antipodal ovule. This is the micropyle, this is the funiculus, and above the funiculus this is the hilum, this is the vascular strand, and innermost these are the synergids, and centermost that is the nuclei. 2 polar nuclei have 1 and 2. So these are the 2 polar nuclei. Outermost layer of the ovule, that is the raphe, and innermost that is the chalaza, and this is the nucleus, and these are the integuments outside the cell. These are the integuments, and these are the antipodal cells. These are the 1, 2, 3. These are the antipodal cells that are 3 number. Next is the central cell, and this is the embryo sac, and this is the egg, that is the oospore. So this is the diagrammatically representation of the antipodal ovule. So all these are the discussions of the various types of the ovules. Next is the hemianthotropous. Next type of the ovule is the hemianthotropous. The body of the ovule is placed at right angle. Hemianthotropous में जो body है ovule की, that is placed at the right angle, and that right angle is 90 degree to the funicle, and वो कहाँ पर present होगी 90 degree पर to the funicle. Example is Malpighiaceae. So this is the hemianthotropous ovule. Next is this is the diagrammatically representation of the hemianthotropous ovule. At the basement, this is the funicular. Next is the embryo sac, and outside the embryo sac, this is the micropyle, and this is the chalaza, and centermost is the nucleus, and outermost layers are the integuments, that is the 2 in number. Outer layer, that is the exine, and the inner layer is the entine. So this is the diagrammatically representation of the hemianthotropous ovule. This is the 5th type of the ovule. Next is the campylotropous. That is the campylotropous ovule. The body is covered but embryo sac is straight. इसमें body जो होगी वो तो covered होगी, but embryo sac is straight. Hilum, chalaza and micropyle come near. इसमें hilum, chalaza and micropyle, all of them they come nearby. Example: Caparis and Chenopodiaceae. So these are the common examples of the campylotropous. Next is this is the diagrammatically representation of campylotropous ovule. This is the funicle, chalaza, nucleus. Outside there are integuments. Innermost is the embryo sac, and this is the micropyle. So this is the diagrammatically representation of the campylotropous ovule. Next is the amphitropous. Both body of ovule and embryo sacs are curved. इसमें ovule की body as well as embryo sac जो होंगे, both of them are curved. Example: cruciferous. The common examples of amphitropous ovule is the cruciferous, and this is the diagrammatically representation of the amphitropous ovule. At the basement, this is the funicle. Innermost layer is the raphe, and in the innermost, that is the chalaza. After that, this is the nucleus, and this is the embryonic sac, and outermost layers, they are known as the integuments. So this is the amphitropous ovule. Next is the circinotropous ovule. The ovule turns at more than 360 degree angle. इसमें जो ovule है वो more than 360 degree angle जो होता है वो टर्न करना जाता है. So funicle becomes coiled, और 360 degree angle से ज्यादा उसको टर्न करने की वजह से उसमें फ्यूनिकल जो होता है दैट इज कॉइल्ड. फ्यूनिकल जो होता है वो क्या कर जाता है, कॉइल्ड कर जाता है अराउंड द ओव्यूल. तो ओव्यूल के अराउंड जो होगा वो क्या कर जाएगा, कॉइल्ड कर जाएगा. एंड द कॉमन एग्जांपल इज द ओवेंशिया. दिस इज द diagrammatically representation of the circinotropous ovule, and as all we know that lower is the micropyle, after that funicle, raphe, integuments, nucleus, and the embryonic sacs. So this is all about the circinotropous ovule. So these are the types of the various forms of the ovules. Next is the megasporogenesis. Next important topic of this chapter is the megasporogenesis. The process of formation of megaspores. ऐसी प्रोसेस जिसमें किस चीज की फॉर्मेशन हो रही है, मेगास्पोर्स की फॉर्मेशन हो रही है फ्रॉम द मेगास्पोर मदर सेल. ऐसा प्रोसेस जिसमें किस चीज की फॉर्मेशन हो रही है, मेगास्पोर की फॉर्मेशन हो रही है फ्रॉम द मेगास्पोर मदर सेल. दैट प्रोसेस इज नोन एज मेगास्पोरोजेनेसिस. That next is the ovules commonly forms a single megaspore. जो ovules होते हैं वो commonly क्या बनाते हैं, single megaspore mother cells को बनाते हैं. That is MMC. That is megaspore mother cells. तो ovules commonly forms the megaspore mother cells in micropylar region. कहाँ पर बनाते हैं वो, micropylar region पर. And already we will discuss about where is the position of the micropylar and megaspore mother cells in the micropylar region of the nucleus. It is larger cell and contains dense cytoplasm. ये सबसे बड़ा सेल है और ये क्या कंटेन करता है, dense cytoplasm and prominent nucleus को. The megaspore mother cell undergoes meiosis. जो megaspore mother cell है वो कौन सी प्रोसेस के अंदर जाएंगे, meiosis की प्रोसेस के अंदर जाएंगे और उसके बाद वो क्या बनाएंगे, 4 megaspores बनाएंगे. That means they divide meiotically. In a majority of flowering plants, अगर हम majority of flowering plants को देखते हैं तो only one of the megaspore is functional. Majority of, अगर हम किस चीज को देखेंगे, फ्लावरिंग प्लांट्स को देखेंगे तो उसमें ओनली वन ओव्यूल होगा दैट इज फंक्शनल. उसमें से एक ही आपका जो मेगास्पोर होगा दैट इज फंक्शनल. द अदर 3 डीजेनरेट. अब हमने कहा था कि वो डिवाइड जैसे म्योटिकली करेंगे दैट मींस दे फॉर्म द 4 मेगास्पोर्स. तो 4 मेगास्पोर्स में से ओनली 1 मेगास्पोर इज फंक्शनल, रेस्ट 3 दे आर डीजेनरेट. उसमें जो रेस्ट 3 होंगे वो क्या हो जाएंगे, डीजेनरेट कर जाएंगे. Only the functional megaspore. अब सिर्फ जो functional megaspore है that is able to develop into the female gametophyte. 3 degenerate हो चुके हैं, एक megaspore जो है that is functional. जो अब हमारे पास एक megaspore functional रहा है वो क्या करेगा, they able to generate. अब वो क्या करेगा, वो develop करेगा किस चीज में, female gametophyte में. Only one functional megaspore they develop into the female gametophyte. Development of the embryonic sacs forms a single megaspore. अब जो development होगी embryonic sacs की वो क्या बनाएगी, single megaspores बनाएगी and that single megaspore is known as the monosporic development and that development is known as the monosporic development. Next is this is the megaspore mother cell that is MMC and they are diploid. Megaspore, haploid, monosporic development, functional megaspore to the embryonic cell. Cells in the nucleus near micropylar region. This is the meiosis. 4 cells haploid होंगे, 3 near micropylar होंगे, degenerate कर जाएंगे. Only one functional जो होगा वो megaspore cell होगा. Functional megaspore जो होगा वो क्या करेगा, enlarge करेगा. Mitotic divisions, 2 nuclei होंगे, move करेंगे opposite poles पर. 2 mitotic divisions होंगे तो 4 nuclei at each pole wall formation. Only after this stage. चलेजा एंड जो होगा वो 3 फॉर्म्स करेगा एंटीपोडल्स को. माइक्रोपाइलर एंड जो होगा वो 3 फॉर्म्स करेगा एग एपरेटस को. रिमेनिंग 2 पोलर न्यूक्लियाई इन अ लार्ज सेंट्रल सेल. जो रिमेनिंग 2 पोलर न्यूक्लियाई रह जाएंगे दैट इज इन द लार्ज सेंट्रल cell. Next is the formation of the embryo sac. How the formation of the embryo sac takes place. The nucleus in the functional megaspore undergoes mitosis. जो nucleus में हमारा functional megaspore है वो undergoes होगा mitosis में और form करेगा two nuclei को. They forms the two important nuclei. They move to the opposite poles. अब जो two nuclei होंगे that means they move to the opposite poles. Thus two nucleate embryo sac is formed. इस वजह से वो two nuclei embryo sac जो होंगे वो वहां पर बनेंगे. Two more sequential mitotic nuclear divisions occur. इसमें दो more sequential mitotic division जो होंगे वो occur करेंगे. This leads to the formation of 4 nucleate and then 8 nucleate stages of the embryo sac. मतलब वो किस चीज को लीड कर रहा है? 4 nucleate and after that 8 nucleate stages of the embryo sac. Next is these nucleate divisions are not followed immediately by the cell wall formation. ये nucleate division जो होंगे ये immediately followed नहीं होते हैं by the cell wall formation. After the 8 nucleate stage cell walls are laid down. जैसे ही 8 nucleate stage होगा जो cell walls होंगे वो क्या हो जाएंगे? laid down हो जाएंगे. This leads to the organization of the typical female gametophyte. अब ये किस चीज को लीड करेगा? Formation of the female gametophyte or the embryo sac. Next is the 6 of 8 nuclei are surrounded by cell walls and are organized into the cells. अब जो 6 हमारे 8 nuclei, 6 of 8 nuclei, 8 nuclei में से 6 जो है वो surrounded by the cell wall and after that surrounding of the cell wall they are organized into the cells. The remaining 2 nuclei, अब उसमें से जो दो remaining nuclei रह गई हैं they are called as the polar nuclei. They are located just beneath the egg apparatus. कहां पर लाई करेंगे वो? बिल्कुल egg apparatus के नीचे in the larger central cells, जहां पर larger central cell होगा. 3 cells are present together. अब इसमें 3 cells होंगे they are present together at the micropylar end. 3 cells इकट्ठे present करेंगे और कहां पर लाई करेंगे? micropylar end पे. They constitute the egg apparatus. वो किस चीज को constitute करेंगे? Egg apparatus को. The egg apparatus consists of 2 synergids. अब egg apparatus में कितने synergids हैं? 2. One is the egg cell. The synergids have cellular thickening. अब synergid जो है उसमें एक cellular thickening होगी at the micropylar tip and that tip is called as a filiform apparatus. They play an important role in guiding the pollen tubes. वो important role play करेंगे किस चीज में? For guiding the pollen tubes into the synergids. 3 cells are at the chalazal end. इसमें 3 cells जो होंगे वो कौन से end पर होंगे? chalazal end पर. And these are known as the antipodal cells. जो cells हमारे कहां पर होंगे? chalazal end पर होंगे. These cells they are known as the antipodal cells. Thus a typical angiosperm embryo sac has 7 cells. अब हम ये कह सकते हैं कि जो typical embryo cell है उसमें जो कितने cells हैं? 7 cells हैं and 8 nuclei जो होंगे that is at the time of maturity. So this is the diagrammatically representation of the female gametophyte. This is the micropylar end and this is the chalazal end. The micropylar end, this is the filiform apparatus. These are synergids and after the synergids this is the egg. This is the central cell and these are the polar nuclei and these are the antipodal cells and this is the micropolar end and opposite to the micropolar end this is the chalazal end and this is the micropolar end and this is the chalazal end. These are the antipodal cells. These are 2 polar nuclei. This is the central cell. These are the eggs and these are the synergids. So this is the diagrammatically representation of the female gametophyte. Next important topic is the pollination. How pollination takes place in the flowering plants. Pollination is a process of transfer of pollen grains. Pollination एक ऐसा process है जिसमें transfer होता है किस चीज का? Pollen grains का from anther to the stigma. कहां से होता है? The transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the flower This is known as the pollination. Pollination is further of two types, that is the self-pollination and the cross-pollination. This is the self-pollination and this is the cross-pollination. Let us start with the self-pollination. What do you mean by self-pollination? Self-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the same flower or a different flower on the same plant. In self-pollination, the flowers are genetically similar. तो self-pollination एक ऐसा प्रोसेस है जिसमें ट्रांसफर होता है pollen grains का from anther to the stigma, either of the same flower or the different flower on the same plant, and it is self-pollination. The flowers are genetically similar. तो self-pollination के केस में जो flowers होंगे, they are genetically similar with each other. Self-pollination is further of two types, that is the autogamy and the getinogamy. That means self-pollination, it is categorized into two categories, that is the autogamy and the getinogamy. First start with this is the autogamy, and this is the diagrammatically representation of the self-pollination, and this is the self-pollination, this is stigma that produces flowers, these are the anthers, and this is the ovule that is produced on the female gametes. So what do you mean by autogamy? It is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the same flower. So autogamy is the process in which there is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the same flower, and it is favored due to the following adaptations. इसको favored किया जाता है, पर क्यों favored किया जाता है? Due to the following adaptations. First is the chasmogamous devices. When the flower expose their mature anther, जब इसमें flowers होंगे वो expose करेंगे अपने mature anthers को and stigma to the pollinating agents. In lab, the stigma lies directly beneath the anthers. Next is the calistogamy. The flowers remain closed. इसमें flowers जो होंगे वो क्या रहेंगे? Closed रहेंगे. So there is no alternative. इस वजह से वहां पर कोई alternative नहीं होगा self pollination का. Example: Paytm, Latrus, and Commelania bengalensis. These are the common example of the calistogamy. Next is the bud pollination. Anthers and stigma bisexual flower. इसमें anthers या स्टिग्मा जो है बाइसेक्सुअल फ्लावर्स के वो मैच्योर करेंगे बिफोर द बड ओपन्स. जैसे ही बड ओपन करेगा, बड के ओपन करने से पहले जो पॉलन ग्रेन्स होंगे एंथर के वो क्या कर जाएंगे? मैच्योर कर जाएंगे, एंड दस सेल्फ पॉलिनेशन टेक्स प्लेस एट द टाइम ऑफ बड स्टेज. इस वजह से जो सेल्फ पॉलिनेशन का प्रोसेस जो होगा दैट टेक्स प्लेस एट द टाइम ऑफ द बड स्टेज, फॉर एग्जांपल पी, व्हीट एक्सेट्रा. Next is the getinogamy. It is transfer of pollen grains from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. इसमें भी क्या होता है? ट्रांसफर होता है pollen grains का of किस चीज में? From anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of the same plant or genetically similar plant. This is known as getinogamy. Next, advantages of self pollination. अब main जो है, what are the various advantages on the behalf of which we can say that self-pollination is beneficial? It maintains purity of the race. किस चीज को maintain करता है? Purity of the race. The plant does not need to produce large number of pollen grains. Plants को जरूरत नहीं होती है कि वो large number of pollen grains को produce करें. It ensures seed production. किस चीज को ensure करता है? वो seed production को. Self-pollination eliminates. Self-pollination जो था वो eliminate करता है bad recessive characters को. So these are the advantages of the self-pollination. Next, disadvantages of the self-pollination: variable and hence adaptability to change, environmental reduced. इसमें क्या है कि variable है, इस वजह से वो adaptability को change कर देता है और environmental को reduce करता है. Vitality decreases and ultimately leads to degeneration. Vitality decrease करेगा and ultimately leads to the process of the degeneration. So this is all about the self-pollination. What are the various types of the self-pollination? What are the advantages of the self-pollination? What are the various disadvantages of the self-pollination? And the next important type of the pollination is the cross-pollination. It is defined as the transfer of pollen grains from anther of a flower to the stigma of different flower. इसमें भी सेम प्रोसेस क्या होगा, ट्रांसफर होगा pollen grains का from anther of one flower to the stigma of the different flower. इसमें जो स्टिग्मा जो ट्रांसफर करेगा वो डिफरेंट फ्लावर पर ट्रांसफर करेगा ऑफ अनदर प्लांट ऑफ सेम और डिफरेंट स्पीशीज. वो दूसरे प्लांट पर जहां वो ट्रांसफर करेगा आइदर वो प्लांट क्या होगा, सेम होगा या फिर डिफरेंट स्पीशीज का होगा. इट इज ऑल्सो नोन एज एलोगेमी. इसको हम एलोगेमी भी बोलते हैं. In xenogamy, pollination takes place between the two flowers. Xenogamy के केस जो pollination है वो take place करेगा two flowers of the plants that are genetically and ecologically different. जो कि जो दो flowers होंगे वो genetically either या तो same होंगे या genetically different होंगे. Genetically और ecologically क्या होंगे, वो different होंगे. So this is the parent 1 and parent 2. ठीक है. पेरेंट 2, पेरेंट 1 में क्या है, these are the filaments and in the filaments there are the attachment of the anthers and there is the pollen movement from one flower to another flower. This is parent 2 and this is the same species as in parent 1. This is the ovary and in the ovary there are number of ovules are present and the ovary that is directly attached with the stigma with the help of a stalk. Next, what are the various devices of the cross pollination? अब cross pollination के devices क्या हैं? The first device is the declining. There are two types of the flowers that are male and female. Declining के case में two types के flowers होंगे and these two types of the flowers are male and female. The plants may be monoecious or dioecious. इसमें जो plants होंगे either they may be monoecious or dioecious. या तो monoecious होंगे या फिर dioecious होंगे. Next is the डिकोगेमी. एंथर एंड स्टिग्मा मैच्योर एट डिफरेंट टाइम्स. इसमें एंथर भी और स्टिग्मा भी, बोथ ऑफ देम दे मैच्योर एट द डिफरेंट टाइम्स. नेक्स्ट इज द प्रोटेंडरी. एंथर्स मैच्योर अर्लियर. इसमें एंथर्स एकदम से मैच्योर कर जाते हैं. एग्जांपल साल्विया, क्लैरोडेनर्डन, सनफ्लावर, रोज. नेक्स्ट इज द प्रोटोगाइनी. स्टिग्मास मैच्योर अर्लियर. इसमें भी स्टिग्मा मैच्योर करते हैं अर्लियर. एग्जांपल प्लेंटागो. नेक्स्ट इज द मैग्नोलिया. Next is the mirabilis. So all these are the examples of the protogyny. Next, self-sterility. Pollen grains are incapable of growing over the stigma. इससे pollen grains होते हैं इनके पास capability नहीं होती है. They are incapable of growing over the stigma of the same flower. Common examples of the self-sterility are the tobacco and some crucifers. The ability of the pollen grains to grow faster. ऐसी ability जिसमें pollen grains जो थे grow करते हैं faster on the stigma of another plant than of the same is called as, उसको हम क्या कहेंगे, that is known as prepotency. Example apple. Fourth type of the cross pollination is the heterostyly. Within the flower the styles and the stamens are at different heights. इसमें अगर हम flowers के साथ देखें तो स्टाइल और स्टेमन जो होंगे वो different heights पर होंगे. Primula and Jasminium have two types of the flowers, that is they are dimorphic heterostyly. Pin eye, long style and short stamen, and thumb eye, that is short style and long stamens. Some plants have trimorphic, that is three heterostyly. Example Lethobarum and Oxalis. Fifth type of the cross pollination, that is herpogamy. It is the presence of natural or physical barrier. इसमें जो presence होगी वो किस चीज की होगी, natural or physical barrier between androecium and gynoecium which help in avoiding self pollination. So in Calotropis अगर हम common example देखते हैं, Calotropis stubini gynoecium that is fused with the pollinium and forms the gynostegium. After the completion of the cross pollination, after that we will discuss about the various advantages of the cross pollination and the disadvantages of cross pollination. So advantages of the cross pollination. Cross pollination introduces genetic recombination and hence variation in offsprings. Cross pollination increases the ability of the offsprings. Cross pollination के पास एक ऐसी कैपेबिलिटी है कि वो किस चीज को इंक्रीज कर सकती है, ability of the offsprings to adapt to the various changes in the environment. The defective character of the race is eliminated. इसमें जो defective character होगा race का, that is eliminated and replaced with the help of a better characters. Next are the disadvantages of cross pollination. Plants have to produce a large number of pollen grains. Plants के पास capability है, that means they produce a large number of the pollen grains. The very good character are likely to be spoiled. इसमें जो अच्छा character है, that is to be spoiled. As external agency is involved. इसमें external agency के involve होने की वजह से chance factor is always there. इस वजह से वहां पर chance factor जो होता है वो always